Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Al Capone, the man who turned prohibition into profit and power. To some, he was a ruthless figure who ruled Chicago with an iron hand. To others, he was a businessman who brought order to chaos. Behind the tailored suits and public charm was a strategist who built one of the most powerful empires in American history. An empire that thrived on silence, loyalty, and control. Before we begin, like this video, we're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family. And share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to keep bringing you more powerful stories. And stay with us because the next story will be even more fascinating, and I know you'll love it. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, close your eyes and imagine the smoky streets of 1922nd Chicago, the soft hum of jazz spilling from hidden clubs, and the empire of a man whose name became legend. Settle in, and let the story of Al Capone guide you into the night. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in Brooklyn in 1899 to parents who thought America would reward steady hands and early mornings. His father cut hair. His mother sewed and sang Italian lullabies that clung to the wallpaper of tiny apartments. There were many children, and not much space. Chores, school, and small dignities kept the day moving. He learned to mind elders, keep his shoes clean, and look for a chance to bring home coins. School felt cramped to him. He was bright enough to do sums in his head, but he bristled at authority and the crowded desks. A clash with a teacher at 14 sent him out the door for good. That single moment changed his path. Classrooms gave way to street corners. He took odd jobs stocking shelves, setting pins, shoveling coal, anything to help the family purse. On those corners he met older boys with fast talk and a code of their own. They taught him about territory, about keeping promises, about backing friends. They also taught him that fear can be a currency. Brooklyn gangs were rough schools. He ran errands, watched doors, learned to sense trouble before it spoke. The quick lesson was simple. Loyalty brought protection. Hesitation invited pain. He never forgot how the confident walk of a neighborhood fixer could silence a brewing argument. He learned to smile at the right time, to flatter, to keep a joke ready, to read a room. He also learned that fists, when used, should be decisive. A door opened in Coney Island that changed his prospects more than any classroom could have. The Harvard Inn, a lively spot run by a swaggering figure named Frankie Yale. Behind the noise music, clinking glasses, flirtation, there were rules, ledgers, schedules, and a command post. Yale noticed the Brooklyn kids' quick eyes and willingness to take orders. Capone worked the door, tended bar, handled tasks that needed a steady presence. One night he cracked wise to the wrong person and paid for it. A blade flashed in a blur, leaving 3 hard lines that would shadow his face forever. That scar wasn't just a mark. It became a calling card in photographs and a nickname he hated. He preferred to be known for sharp suits and a neat haircut. Among close friends, a slang term, snorky, meaning stylish, felt better. He had charm, real charm, the kind that can take the heat out of a crowded room. He used it to move up. Tasks became more delicate, keeping peace between hotheads, making sure deliveries arrived, smoothing over disputes before they turned into feuds that hurt business. He watched how money flowed in circles, suppliers, guards, drivers, the house take, and how a man with a clear head could keep chaos profitable. He also learned that police attention could be redirected with quiet handshakes and regular envelopes. That set of skills would define the next decade of his life. At 19, he married May Coughlin, an Irish girl with a soft smile and a practical mind. Their son, Albert, known as Sonny, arrived that winter. Capone was tender with the child, protective in a way that startled the men who had seen him stare down angry drunks. Family dinners mattered. He bought flowers, remembered birthdays, tried to be home for supper when he could. The world outside paid attention to toughness. At home, he wanted peace. For a short time, he stepped away from nightlife and kept books as a clerk, proving he could manage numbers as well as faces. His father's death deepened his desire to be the provider. Then a call came from Chicago, a city that drew ambitious men like a magnet draws filings. Johnny Torrio, a composed strategist from his New York days, needed reliable help in a place on the verge of enormous change. By 1919, Capone was in Chicago, a sprawling metropolis of stockyards, new skyscrapers, and political deals struck in smoke-filled back rooms. He started as a driver and bodyguard, then a manager of busy rooms where men gambled, drank, and forgot their day jobs. On paper, purveyors of vice were just rowdy businessmen. In practice, those rooms needed discipline, logistics, and money counting that would put a warehouse foreman to shame. He oversaw doormen, dealers, runners, all moving in a quiet ballet to keep tables spinning and profits steady. Then the country tried an experiment that made fortunes overnight. The Volstead Act went into effect in early 1920, banning the sale of alcohol. A thirsty nation didn't stop drinking. It simply changed who got paid. Torrio saw a once-in-a-century opening. He drew lines on a map. Routes, safe houses, drivers, breweries to convert, officials to court, lawyers to retain. Capone helped build that lattice into something that ran on time. He wasn't just a tough. He was a manager who could turn chaos into a schedule. He learned the trade from top to bottom, from the knock on the back door to the stamp on a crate, from a quiet loan to a silent partnership. The old boss of Chicago's vice world, Big Jim Colosimo, had gotten rich running brothels and gambling halls. He didn't share Torrio's excitement for the liquor windfall, and reportedly resisted jumping into a new, riskier racket. In May 1920, he was shot in the foyer of his cafe. Speculation swirled that Torrio arranged it to clear the path for expansion, and rumors placed a visiting New York gunman at the scene. No court proved those whispers. What mattered for Chicago's streets was that Torrio emerged as the new center of gravity, and Capone's responsibilities grew by the week. Bootlegging required a delicate balance. Brewers needed protection. Drivers needed safe routes. Warehouse guards needed clear instructions. When to talk. When to stay silent. City officials, some friendly, some not, needed consideration. Lawyers had to be on retainer and ready to untangle raids before they crumpled supply lines. Capone helped standardize payoffs and payrolls, turning what could have been street-level improvisation into a machine. His talent was obvious. He could talk to a precinct captain in the afternoon, laugh with a judge at dinner, and calm a dock worker at midnight. He placed trusted relatives and old friends in key spots. Brother Ralph handled operations. Brother Frank brought a steady, careful presence. The outfit quietly known by insiders wasn't a single shop. It was an umbrella folding many schemes under one canopy. Liquor, gambling, vice houses, protection, and political influence. Not every day was smooth. Rivals watched for any slip. Disputes flared over territories and pickup times. In those moments, negotiations came first. When talks failed, fists were followed by gunfire in alleys or on dark roads. Those eruptions were fast and rarely solved anything for long. Capone preferred to avoid any mess that brought headlines, but he would not back down when confronted. His rule was practical. Keep business moving, keep damage contained, keep the money count correct, and make sure the right people felt looked after. As profits soared, visibility brought risk. Reformers gained traction. In 1923, Chicago elected William Deaver, a mayor who took enforcing prohibition seriously. Raids multiplied. Establishments shut down or were seized. Torrio and Capone met the moment with a classic adjustment: move out, regroup, and co-opt smaller jurisdictions. They shifted their base to Cicero, a suburb with friendly town officials, pliable police, and a tax base too small to resist the influx of new money. Offices appeared in nondescript buildings. Trucks came and went, at odd hours. Politicians enjoyed new streams of campaign cash and a chance to take credit for economic activity they didn't fully understand. In Cicero, the mix of business and politics became a single brew. To keep routes open and the town welcoming, election outcomes mattered. Capone's organization assembled a plan to ensure the right slate won. The approach wasn't subtle. Friendly candidates received support. Opponents felt pressure. Polling places were watched by men whose hats were tilted just so. Payoffs greased the process. Ballot stuffing and intimidation, ugly as they were, became part of a strategy to secure the base from which the larger operation ran. On Election Day in April 1924, tension turned hot. At a polling place, a confrontation spun into chaos. Officers moved in. Capone's brother Frank, who had earned a reputation as the steady hand, was shot and killed during the clash. No graphic scene was needed to understand the impact. A family member was gone, and it happened on a day when politics and the street collided head-on. For all his iron composure, Al felt that loss deeply. He wept, then he hardened. He paid for the funeral, showed the city a face of grief, and quietly rearranged his crew. Where persuasion had been the preferred tool, he invested more in protection details and security, reasoning that a public fight had already been forced upon them. The death changed his posture. He didn't abandon charm. He doubled it in public life, presenting himself as a businessman misunderstood by moralists. He gave showy tips at restaurants, signed checks for community events, and cultivated reporters who were happy to write color pieces about a lively character with an easy laugh. Behind that grin, the operation absorbed the shock of reformers' raids and political friction. New breweries came online in safer spots. Trusted drivers learned alternate routes. Lawyers filed papers to gum up prosecutions. Friendly cops passed along warnings before stings landed. He paid for silence with precision, tracking every promise in notebooks that mattered more than any pistol. Crime stacked up in ledgers and in real life. Illegal manufacturing and sale of alcohol during Prohibition, protection rackets that extracted regular payments from business owners, ownership of gambling dens that operated outside the law, bribery of public officials, and involvement direct or through subordinates in violent retaliations when rivals attacked or defectors betrayed confidences. He didn't file forms for any of that. He avoided official titles and tried to keep his name off leases and corporate paperwork. The state wanted order. He sold a different order, one that relied on personal deals rather than statutes, an order that worked for those inside the circle and punished those who didn't play along. Yet there were lines even he recognized. He discouraged random harm that spooked the public, preferring a city where ordinary people felt safe walking home. He wanted money, not mayhem. When neighborhood kids asked for a donation for uniforms or a school event, he reached into his pocket. That generosity, sincere as it could be in the moment, also built goodwill that shielded him when headlines turned rough. Many people saw only the cleaner half of the picture, the caretaker of jobs in trucks and warehouses, the man who paid wages on time when factories slowed. Chicago's underworld wasn't a single family. It was a collection of outfits with different histories and temperaments. The North Side had its own leadership and its own ambitions. Milwaukee and downstate suppliers eyed the money on the table. Government pressure rose and fell with elections and scandals. Into that swirl stepped a man who had learned early how to stay 2 steps ahead. He spent freely where it mattered. He staged public relations with a smile. He brought a sense of organization that made him indispensable. He liked nice things. Silk ties, a good car, a roomy house, but those were always secondary to the bigger prize: control. By the mid-1920s, his name was known from newsroom to police station. He kept a loyal inner circle and a swelling payroll. His office phone rang constantly. Visitors waited. He tracked deliveries, tallied receipts, approved payoffs, mediated disputes, and planned expansions. He didn't pretend to be lawful. He simply argued, often with conviction, that the city and its leaders had failed to give people what they wanted, and that he had filled the gap. The record shows the truth in unvarnished terms. He built a business empire by breaking the law. He paid people to look away. He punished threats, and he smiled while doing it. The city had changed him, and he had changed the city. What began in a cramped Brooklyn apartment had turned into a managerial command over thousands of moving parts. There were soft moments home with May and Sonny, afternoons with his mother, a quiet smoke after dinner, and there were ruthlessly practical ones. Every choice set up the next stage, where rivalry would grow darker, politics would tilt, and the stakes would become national news. Power in Chicago shifted with the seasons. After the trouble at the 1,924 polls in Cicero, maps were redrawn in private rooms, and the North Side watched the South Side with a stare that never blinked. Dean O'Banion ran the North Side combine with a florist's touch, soft on the surface, prickly underneath. He made money on beer, gambling, and favors, and he kept his books close. Late that year, he pulled a move many considered unforgivable. He arranged a sale of a brewery to Johnny Torrio, then tipped authorities so the place would be raided right after the deal closed, putting Torrio in legal peril while O'Banion walked away with cash. In Chicago's underworld, profit mattered, but trust mattered more. That trick set off consequences that changed every block from the Loop to the lake. On a quiet November morning in 1924, O'Banion stood among flowers at his shop when attackers stepped inside. Shots rang out, then silence fell over the roses and ribbon. Chicago whispered that Torrio had settled accounts. Some said men loyal to Frankie Yale traveled from New York for the job. Capone, by then Torrio's right hand, was linked in rumors because he was close to the people who benefited. Courts never pinned the crime on him. Yet the streets decided the North Side had declared one kind of war and the South Side had answered with another. The fallout was immediate. Jaime Weiss, O'Banion's fierce friend, and George Bugs Moran vowed not to let the matter rest. The weather turned cold. Tempers stayed hot. In January 1925, retaliation arrived at Torrio's doorstep. He was ambushed near his apartment, wounded, and jolted into a rare decision. Quit. While still breathing, he recovered enough to sail for Italy, leaving daily control to the younger man who had been keeping the books, soothing arguments, and paying the bills. At 26, Capone inherited a network that was already large and getting larger breweries in back rooms and converted warehouses, fleets of trucks running to the suburbs at night, quiet agreements with saloon keepers, and retainers for lawyers who could argue a case into circles. He didn't take a coronation photo. He went to work. He centered operations in Cicero, where a restaurant, a hotel suite, and a small office functioned like coordinated gears. He switched between tailored jackets and simple shirts, depending on the visit, one set for aldermen and union men, another for drivers and guards. He had lieutenants who fit the jobs. Jack McGurn handled enforcement details. Frank Nitti kept distribution smooth. Greasy Thumb. Jake Guzik handled the delicate ledger of payoffs. Trusted Brothers oversaw crews and schedules. His goal was to stop improvising and start standardizing. Deliveries ran on time. Duplicate routes existed for emergencies. Drop sites rotated. Phones were changed often, and each crew understood what it was supposed to do without a lot of talk. Books balancing liquor, gambling, vice houses, and insurance payments showed a system far bigger than one man with a temper. It looked like a company illegal. Yes, but organized. Chicago's appetite didn't shrink under Prohibition. It expanded. Dance halls needed liquor. Hotels wanted it for private parties. Theaters arranged quiet service for patrons who slipped into side rooms between acts. Capone's crews met that demand. They made beer in disguised breweries. They bought Canadian whiskey from smugglers who ran it across the lakes. They bought from Detroit's Purple Gang when it made sense. Money flowed into bank accounts under other names. Cash also went into envelopes that kept doors unlocked. Bribery illegal payments to officials wasn't a side note. It was a line item. Police captains, city clerks, and some judges received consideration to look the other way, or to signal a raid early enough that the only thing officers found was dust and a clean floor. Every move created pressure from rivals who wanted routes and customers. Vice led the North Side response with nerve. Moran backed him with relentless energy. Violent incidents, fast-moving ambushes, and street attacks marked the calendar. Capone disliked chaos that hit civilians, not out of soft sentiment but because it wrecked business. He tried to contain damage by staging talks. In back rooms, he offered splits on territories and schedules. He proposed boundaries that let each side profit without constant bloodshed. Some sessions ended with handshakes. Others collapsed before the coffee cooled. In the spring of 1926, a killing jolted the city's moralists into new outrage. William McSwiggan, a young assistant state's attorney with a reputation for being bold, left a tavern at night with two men tied to Capone's circle. A car pulled up. Gunfire erupted. McSwiggan died. Newspapers screamed. Investigators raided properties linked to Capone. The mayor promised clean streets. Capone vanished for a stretch, reportedly staying out of state while lawyers negotiated. He eventually reappeared, submitted to questioning, and walked out without charges. The message he took from that storm was pragmatic. Public opinion mattered. From then on, he courted reporters, sat with columnists, staged photo ops at baseball games, and reminded anyone who'd print it that he donated to charities, and kept payrolls going when factories cut hours. None of that erased the lists on detectives' desks, but it gave him a way to speak directly to the crowd. Jaime Weiss, still burning over O'Banion's fate, kept pressure on the South Side. That fall, Capone barely survived a daytime attack outside his Cicero base. Cars eased by. Gunfire tore into brick and glass. By chance or planning, he was shielded. He took the hint and moved with even more caution. Escorts doubled. His favorite car got extra steel. He accepted a brief truce arranged by intermediaries at a downtown hotel, nodding through proposals while leaving his defenses in place. The peace didn't last. In October 1926, Weiss was shot and killed near Holy Name Cathedral. The scene was shocking not for blood, which newspapers avoided describing, but for the symbolism. Midday, on a busy street, near a church, with pedestrians diving for cover. Police called in everyone they could reach, including Capone's lieutenants. The city didn't get a courtroom confession. It got an uneasy lull, and a new North Side boss, Moran, headstrong, stubborn, unwilling to bend. With Weiss gone, Capone doubled down on discipline. He didn't want Chicago turned into a free-for-all. He reorganized crews, tightened scheduling, and reduced the number of people who knew sensitive details. He brought in specialists to fix cars, to forge documents that disguised shipments, to scout new safe locations. He balanced fear with incentives, bonuses for smooth delivery runs, extra pay for holiday shifts, steady wages even when raids forced a temporary pause. He leveraged that reliability into loyalty, making defections rarer. Yet loyalty had a price. When men threatened to flip or a rival tried to grab a route, enforcement followed. The outfit's record by the late 1922 included bootlegging, operating gambling houses without licenses, running vice districts, extorting protection money from businesses, bribing officials, witness tampering, and directing retaliatory violence. Capone's personal involvement in every single act can't be proven. What's clear is that he built and led the system that produced them. Money piled up faster than ever. He moved his family into a better place, wore suits cut from expensive cloth, and tipped in ways that turned waiters into fans. He went to ball games, posed with boxers, showed up at charity events, and sometimes paid hospital bills for people who had never met him. He did it because he liked playing the patron, and because it worked. A baker with a new oven told neighbors the outfit wasn't just trouble, it was also a paycheck. A band leader who landed a steady gig at a speakeasy was less likely to testify when a grand jury asked for stories. Capone understood that smooth talk could do more than a threat in half the situations he faced. Still, there were enemies he couldn't charm. Joe Aiello, a Sicilian grocer with ambition, detested Capone's growing influence over an ethnic fraternal society that acted as a power broker. Aiello gathered allies, plotted with Moran, and reportedly offered money to anyone who could get close to Capone and poison or shoot him. Cooks warned Capone about suspicious requests. Waiters told stories. Plans fell apart. Aiello's campaign didn't end in 1926 or 1927, but it deepened a feud that would stretch into the next decade. Capone responded with what he knew best. Reinforce alliances, keep bodyguards close, rotate routes, and chip away at opponents' businesses. By 1927, his network looked like a city within the city. Breweries operated behind brick walls that muffled machine hums. Chemistry labs checked quality. Dispatchers staged convoys after midnight. Runners shuttled cash to lawyers in the morning. Friendly union officials helped smooth trucking schedules. Pickers moved crates from rail sidings to trucks without signatures that could be traced. Bartenders kept track of which officers favored which places, who needed an envelope, who wanted only a handshake and a promise. It was illegal commerce at industrial scale, with a manager who kept numbers in his head and names in a small book guarded like a crown jewel. Law enforcement adjusted. Federal agents learned from botched raids, worked with accountants, and studied bank records. That year, a Supreme Court decision made headlines. Income from illegal activity was still income under the tax code. Everyone who profited was supposed to file returns. Capone didn't start signing forms because of a newspaper headline. He continued living in cash, used fronts, let others hold titles, and believed well-placed payments could keep the system running. It was a miscalculation that would matter later, but at the time he felt untouchable. Local power still beat distant statute in most day-to-day situations, and most juries didn't like Prohibition enough to punish those who violated it. The city's political winds shifted too. After a reform-minded mayor tried to clamp down and burned out, Chicago swung back toward a machine politician who understood how to count votes, and who wasn't eager to pick a fight with the outfit if it could be avoided. Capone exploited that gap. He threw money into campaigns that favored a lighter hand on enforcement. Election season again featured pressure tactics: watchers at polling places, rides to precincts for friendly voters, cold stares for those who backed the other side. Ugly? Yes. Effective? Often. The lesson was basic. If the law couldn't be wiped from the books, it could be bent by friendly authorities. Public swagger masked private caution. He slept behind layers of guards, ate simple meals prepared by people he trusted, and switched cars often. He liked music jazz at a club where the horn section didn't ask questions and games of chance in back rooms where the door closed tight. He also maintained the ritual of Sunday dinners with his mother and wife whenever possible. He was affectionate with his son, telling jokes, giving presents, checking on homework even when he left schooling early himself. Those scenes didn't erase his record. They showed his split life. In one room, a father. In another, a boss who could reassign a crew in 15 words. Newspapers began to play up the contradictions. One day, a photo of him smiling with a stray dog. The next, a stern editorial listing cases that went cold. He cultivated reporters who treated him as a colorful figure, turning hard reality into copy that sometimes softened the edges. He let them see the suits, the cigars, the easy laugh. He hid the spreadsheets of bribes and the lists of rivals marked for pressure. He told one columnist that he was meeting demand created by bad law, a claim repeated often enough that some readers nodded along even if they didn't agree. By the end of 1927, Capone stood at the center of a complicated web. Cicero functioned as a headquarters. City Hall and the courts remained an obstacle course. The North Side regrouped under Moran. Aiello plotted. The Purple Gang sold supplies when prices worked. Federal agents gathered paper. Local cops divided into those who took money and those who tried to resist. The outfit's crimes: bootlegging, rackets that extracted payments from fearful business owners, control of vice districts, illegal betting shops, bribes to officials, assaults on rivals, witness intimidation, and killings carried out in service of the enterprise were not secrets, though proof in court often proved elusive. Capone's pride was that he kept the machine turning, even when the weather turned rough. He had no reason to think the next year would be different. More roots, more beer, more cash, more handshakes. He bought a place in Florida for winter retreats, figuring warm air and distance could keep him calm, while lieutenants watched Chicago. He told friends he wanted fewer fights, more profit, and quiet. But rivals wanted headlines, and factions inside the city were not done testing his grip. The stage was set for spectacles that would travel beyond Chicago's borders, turn his name into a national shorthand for organized crime, and tempt him to believe that influence could outrun law forever. Warm air off the water in Florida felt like a promise that trouble could be managed with quiet talks and a slower heartbeat. He bought a house on Palm Island where palms rustled at night and neighbors waved from porches, a world apart from Chicago's hard corners. The move wasn't retirement. It was a way to step back, think bigger, and let lieutenants keep the wheels turning. He wanted a clean schedule: winter weeks in Miami's sunshine, spring and summer back in Cicero's offices, yet the city he ruled didn't relax just because he took his hat off. In Chicago, the feud with Joe Aiello deepened. Aiello was furious over who controlled a powerful fraternal society that acted like a switchboard for favors and influence. Capone supported Tony Lombardo, a calm, business-first leader who understood how to keep the peace and funnel opportunities to friends. Aiello hated that outcome. He courted allies, sent messages that sounded like threats, and reportedly offered money for anyone who could hurt Capone or the people around him. Restaurants received strange requests from men who didn't look like regulars. Chefs warned Capone about odd deliveries. Bodyguards stood closer. Summer turned to fall in 1928, and a shock hit the heart of Capone's circle. Lombardo, the man he backed, was gunned down on a busy street near downtown. The city, already used to hard news, gasped. Police rounded up the usual suspects and some unusual ones, but indictments didn't stick. Fingers pointed at Aiello. Capone took it personally. He had tried to push business over vendetta, but this was both. He added more guards, kept routes moving, and waited. Patience didn't mean forgetting, it meant planning. The feud would keep, and he had deliveries to make. While rivalries flared, his operation reached a scale most people in the city couldn't imagine. Fronts bought malt and hops by the carload. Mechanics shielded engines and tires for non-stop runs. Safe apartments sat over grocery stores and tailor shops. Lawyers kept in touch with court clerks who could hint at a search warrant. Money moved from back rooms to banks under cousins' names, then into bonds and properties that looked legitimate to anyone who didn't know which ledger pages were missing. Gambling floors clicked with dice and cards under low light. Protection crews collected weekly fees from businesses that wanted predictable days in neighborhoods where unpredictability cost more. Brothels operated out of sight, managed by people who answered to lieutenants with strict rules. No fights that draw onlookers, no foolish talk to reporters, no bragging. Where city ordinances demanded permits, cash made problems fade. Where an inspector refused to bend, another inspector showed up instead. Influence worked best when it stayed unseen. But he liked public stages too. He sat ringside at boxing matches, smiled for photographers at ballparks, posed at charity dinners, and sent checks to hospitals that needed new beds. When reporters asked about crime, he told them he was just a businessman meeting demand created by a bad law. He said he didn't want street battles, that he preferred agreements. Many citizens believed none of it. Some believed a little. Others believed almost everything, tired of a dry nation drinking in secret, while officials who preached morality took envelopes to keep quiet. At the dawn of 1929, another public moment arrived that would make his name echo beyond Chicago. The North Side remained defiant under George Moran. Hijackings caused losses. Trucks vanished and reappeared empty. Drivers were threatened. Capone's people sent messages. Stop raiding our shipments. Respect boundaries. Choose profit over grudges. The North Side didn't blink. Then came a morning in mid-February that changed the city's conversation. Attackers, some dressed to look official, appeared at a garage used by Moran's men. Inside, 7 were lined up and shot. The city heard the news and froze. The details left no doubt that this was not a random outbreak. It was a targeted strike meant to end a rivalry in one act. Moran escaped by chance. He arrived late or saw something he didn't like and stepped away. Accounts differ, but his outfit never recovered its old strength. Capone was in Florida when it happened. He denied involvement and offered an alibi. Police didn't charge him. No court ever convicted him for that act. Yet the public connected his name to the event, and the connection stuck. Editorials asked how anyone could talk about charity work after a day like that. Federal authorities took new interest. Candidates who wanted reform seized the moment. The story traveled coast to coast, turning a city's underworld dispute into national shorthand for Prohibition-era carnage. Capone understood the danger. He told columnists that violence was bad for business, that he wanted calm. He invited a few writers to Miami to see him in a white suit near the water, a picture of leisure, a man supposedly far from any rowdy garage. It didn't quiet the noise. The moment had reset the game. Behind the headlines, a different kind of pressure built, the kind no truck convoy could outrun. Treasury agents and special investigators had learned from previous failures. They started following paper instead of people. A Supreme Court ruling had just made it clear that illegal profits counted as income for tax purposes. That gave accountants a new lever on untouchable figures. In Chicago, a patient, methodical team led by Frank Wilson began to map a money trail ledgers seized in raids, bank slips tied to fake names, cashier's checks purchased with cash. Clerks, who thought they were carrying out harmless tasks, found themselves on witness lists. A cashier who signed a check months ago faced questions about where the funds originated. The dull machinery of bookkeeping, long ignored by tough guys who preferred muscle and cash, became a threat. Capone still tried to manage the risk with his favorite methods: public charm, well-paid lawyers, and strategic retreats. That spring, a meeting of national-level figures reportedly took place in Atlantic City. Its agenda focused on reducing the kind of violence that brought federal heat. Accounts vary on exactly who attended, but most versions place Capone in the room. The pitch was simple. The liquor trade could be divided, prices stabilized, routes respected, arguments handled without headlines. In theory, that plan suited everyone. In practice, egos and old grudges never vanish completely. Still, it signaled a shift towards syndicate thinking that would endure long after Prohibition ended. After the conference, Capone made a move that surprised many. In May 1929, he was arrested in Philadelphia for carrying a concealed weapon. The case sped through court. He received a 1-year sentence. Some observers thought he accepted it as a strategic timeout, a way to show he could submit to a penalty that didn't threaten his core interests, while the furor over the Chicago killings cooled. He was sent to the state penitentiary, where his cell later became famous for its furnishings, lamps, rugs, a radio suggesting the reach of his money even behind bars. He played the model inmate, kept to a routine, and used the quiet to let lieutenants hold the line back home. While he sat in prison, Chicago kept changing. Big Bill Thompson still occupied City Hall, a mayor who liked showmanship and looked the other way if his allies did too. But reformers didn't disappear. Community groups pushed for raids. Federal men worked without fanfare. Some cops decided they would not take money to step aside. Others took it and justified it as a war they couldn't win. Moran tried to rebuild with fewer friends and less fear to throw around. Aiello remained a thorn, still scheming, still drawing heat. Drive-by attacks were less frequent, but not gone. The outfit's breweries ran, though not as loudly. Crews learned to take on smaller loads, to avoid regular patterns, to keep radios handy for last-minute changes. Capone returned to the street in March 1930, after serving part of his sentence for good behavior. He didn't strut out. He let the cameras roll while saying very little. He went home to hugs, sat down to a meal with family, and then called meetings. He asked for status updates on every arm of the business. Beer output, whiskey supply lines from Canada, income from card rooms, payouts to officials, notes from lawyers about pending cases, budgets for political campaigns that needed finishing funds. He reviewed security as if he were back on the loading docks, reminding his men to switch cars, vary departure times, and never assume a quiet week meant safety. But the tone in the air had changed. The Chicago Crime Commission put his name on top of a list that called certain figures public enemy, a phrase that newspapers loved. He was number one. It was meant to shame, rally the decent, and warn the rest. He shrugged to reporters and called it a stunt, yet he felt the shift. The federal government talked about him in briefings. Treasury agents were no longer guests in Chicago. They were fixtures. A new group of Prohibition agents built a reputation for refusing bribes. They cut into breweries with axes, padlocked doors, and documented everything for court. They were nicknamed the Untouchables, and while their raids did not end his reign alone, they created daily headaches and chipped away at the myth that money could make every wall swing open. Capone countered with a mix of forward motion and public relations. He opened new gambling rooms where the house odds were fixed, invited reporters to see children receiving boxes of food paid for with his checks, and told columnists that he would gladly leave the liquor trade if the law changed. He reminded anyone with a notepad that he had been unfairly blamed for crimes without proof. He kept the charity work steady. School uniforms here, funeral costs there, aid for families when a breadwinner lost a job. Those acts were real and made a difference for those who received them. They also served his larger aim: make the neighborhood see him as a provider rather than a predator. Still, there was no hiding the criminal foundation. The outfit's books reflected profits from illegal beer sales, untaxed whiskey, gambling halls without licenses, brothels that paid a cut, insurance fees from storefronts that feared vandalism if they declined, and payoffs to city and county officials to soften raids or slow prosecutions. Witnesses who cooperated risked threats. Some withdrew statements after late-night visitors appeared. Lawyers stalled cases with motions. Defendants forgot details on the stand. A few jurors, approached at home or enticed with cash, reconsidered their duty. The machine thrived on secrecy, pressure, and timely generosity. But accountants do not frighten easily, and paper doesn't forget. By the end of 1930, the tax case that seemed like a rumor had begun to take shape. Investigators located a reluctant bookkeeper who had handled cash for one of Capone's gambling rooms. They linked cashier's checks to a man who served as a bridge between cash registers and bank counters. They collected receipts from stores where front companies bought expensive suits and jewelry. They tracked payments for hotel suites and travel paid in cash, but recorded by someone for later reimbursement. A letter from a tax lawyer made an overture to settle the bill, listing rough income figures from several years. It was meant as a starting point for negotiation. It read like an admission to investigators who knew what to do with it. The city, meanwhile, watched its favorite celebrity outlaw grow cautious. He traveled with a larger security detail. He drove in caravans with decoys. He told friends that staying out late was not worth it. He worried about his son's safety at school. May kept the home steady, shielding the family from reporters who camped outside. He visited his mother faithfully, as he always had. He ate simple pasta and meat at the kitchen table, laughed with nephews, and then stepped outside to a car that took him back to a world of ledgers and whispered plans. Joe Aiello's story moved toward its last chapter. He orchestrated more schemes, tried to align with out-of-town muscle, and bragged at dinners that Capone would be pushed aside. The outfit treated him as a persistent danger, not an equal. He was watched, outmaneuvered, and isolated. The end would come in a way that sent a message to anyone still thinking about filling his shoes. Even so, Chicago's roster of ambitious men never ran out. For every name that disappeared, another stepped forward, eyes bright with the same dream of control. By the time the year turned again, Capone could feel that the ground had tilted. Prohibition had made him rich, but it had also built a target on his back that glittered in every headline. The North Side was no longer a daily menace, yet the federal government had become a larger one. He had always believed that with enough charm, enough cash, and enough discipline, he could steer any situation. Now, in quiet moments on Palm Island or behind the blinds of his Cicero office, he weighed choices that looked narrower than before. He could dig in and fight the tax case and the liquor raids, hoping juries would stay skeptical and witnesses would stay silent. He could gamble on politics in Washington shifting and the national mood forgiving. Or he could accept that a courtroom, not a garage, would decide his fate. Chicago's music played on horns in clubs, dance steps on polished floors, but the city moved under new rhythms: ledgers, subpoenas, testimonies, fingerprints. For a man who had grown up mastering every shade of human pressure, the cold logic of paperwork posed a knot that couldn't be untied with a smile. The next moves would be made under bright lights, with clerks recording every word, and the margin for mistakes shrinking by the day. The title that stuck like glue arrived in big type: Public Enemy Number 1. The tag handed out by the Chicago Crime Commission in 1930 made his name sound less like a man and more like a weather system. Reporters loved it. Reformers waved it at council meetings. It meant extra eyes on every corner near his offices, extra notes slipped to federal desks, and bolder talk in clubs where citizens argued over whether prohibition had done the city more harm than good. He told cameras it was a joke, a badge handed out by people who didn't understand the economy that sprang up after liquor went underground. Yet he understood that kind of label can tighten a net. Pressure rose on several fronts at once. Elliot Ness, a young agent who took pride in refusing envelopes, led a tight crew that staged precision raids against breweries and loading docks. Their work didn't put Capone in a cell, but it wrecked equipment, seized trucks, and reminded operators that someone was counting barrels. Each swing of a sledgehammer cost money. Each padlock forced an overnight shuffle. Meanwhile, the quieter treasurymen accountants with patience and a taste for paper trails kept stacking receipts, bank slips, and ledgers taken in raids that looked minor at the time but turned into puzzle pieces in a larger case. That combination, loud raids that starved supply lines and silent paperwork that mapped income, made 1,930 a turning point. The feud with Joe Aiello reached its last act in that boiling year. Aiello had spent years sparring over influence inside the Unione Siciliana and beyond. He had offered rewards for anyone who could deliver harm to Capone's circle, flirted with alliances, and survived earlier attempts on his life. In late October, he was struck down on a city street, a headline that confirmed, for many, that Chicago's old rules had not changed. Challenge the biggest outfit, and expect a reckoning. Police spread a dragnet, took statements, and issued strong words. No jury ever put Capone at the center of that murder. The message on the sidewalk didn't need a courtroom to be read. With Aiello gone, one of the last independent sources of pressure vanished. The outfit could focus on business and on the growing federal case. Even in the midst of public fury, Capone understood showmanship. That winter, as the Depression deepened and families lined up for relief, he funded a soup kitchen that served hot meals to the unemployed. The sign outside promised free soup, coffee, and donuts. Men and women ducked in from wind that cut through coats, stood in line, and left with something warm in their hands. The gesture was part charity, part public relations. It made vivid a pitch he had been making for years. When the system failed, he kept people fed. Newspapers printed photos of steaming bowls in one column and editorials about bootlegging in another, leaving readers to reconcile the contradiction. Miami had once been a refuge between storms, a place where white suits and sunny porches felt far from grudge matches and raids. That distance shrank. Local officials, under pressure to show they could resist outside influence, used nuisance laws to harass him, served warrants on thin charges, and made it plain they wanted him gone. He pushed back in court and moved on for a time rather than escalate a sideshow. The house on Palm Island stayed in the family. The sense of sanctuary faded. Back in Chicago, he worked to keep discipline as the Untouchables cut into operations. Breweries were dispersed to reduce risk. Smaller batches moved through more channels. Drivers changed routes at the last minute. Watchers at intersections counted patrol cars and phoned ahead. Lawyers sat on retainers large enough to keep them available at a day's notice. Jake Guzik maintained the delicate schedule of payments to those who remained friendly, while Frank Nitti handled distribution with the temperament of a logistics chief. Capone's daily work still looked like management. People, supply, risk, and the occasional blunt decision when a rival crossed a boundary. The federal tax case began to take visible shape. Investigators linked cashier's checks to men who worked at a Cicero gambling room. A bookkeeper, reluctant and nervous, walked agents through entries that turned into a map of hidden profits. A lawyer representing Capone sent a letter to the Treasury with income figures meant to open a negotiation about back taxes. That letter, read by investigators trained to see admissions where others saw bargaining, became a cornerstone. A Supreme Court ruling had already decided that illegal income counted just like any other for taxation. The math would be straightforward. The courtroom battle would not. Spring 1931 brought a drumbeat of legal moves. A grand jury handed up indictments on multiple counts of income tax evasion covering several years. Separate charges for prohibition violations hovered in the background, threatening to pile on if needed. Capone, reading the mood and thinking a limited concession might cap the damage, surprised observers by entering a guilty plea in June after what he believed was a deal with prosecutors promising a sentence short enough to leave his command intact. He treated it like he treated most negotiations. Give a little, keep the core. Judge James Wilkerson had other ideas. At a July hearing, he announced that any deal proposed by lawyers did not bind the court. He would decide on punishment. In an instant, the strategy collapsed. Capone withdrew his plea and prepared for trial. The message was unmistakable. The courtroom would not be managed like a ward office. The trial opened in October 1931. On the first morning, Wilkerson quietly swapped the entire jury panel for a fresh one from another courtroom, a move intended to blunt any attempt at tampering. The case that followed was not a morality play about liquor or a treatise on public corruption. It was arithmetic presented by witnesses who handled cash, issued checks, and kept lists. Clerks testified about deposits in names that led back to the same place. Bank employees pointed to large transactions made with cash supplied by men tied to the outfit. Former employees of gambling rooms explained the flow of bets and the slice that went upstairs. An expert from the Treasury calculated income based on spending that far outpaced any declared earnings. Defense lawyers argued that none of it proved personal receipt, that fronts and family names blurred the picture. The jury deliberated and returned with a mixed verdict. Not guilty on some counts, guilty on others. It was enough. On the 17th of October 1931, he was convicted of several counts of tax evasion. In November, Wilkerson imposed the sentence that would define the next year's 11 years in federal custody, a substantial fine, court costs, and an order to make good on unpaid taxes. He also faced a 6-month sentence for contempt of court for ignoring a federal subpoena years earlier. Appeals followed because appeals always do, but the core result stood. For the first time, the man who had moved through Chicago with an air of inevitability found himself behind a door that didn't open for charm. While legal papers moved between courts, the outfit adjusted. Nitty took on a larger share of daily authority, with Guzik and others ensuring payrolls and payoffs stayed on schedule. Younger figures, Tony Accardo among them, watched, learned, and kept crews in line. Beer still flowed into hidden rooms. Cards still slapped down on felt at tables hidden behind false walls. The city did not turn pure overnight because one man left a desk. Yet the system felt the loss of its central voice, the one that mediated disputes with a mix of smile and steel. In May 1932, after exhausting the last obvious legal maneuver, Capone entered federal custody at the Cook County Jail and then the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta. Early reports claimed he tried to soften prison routine with the same tactics that had worked in other institutions. Atlanta was different. Administrators had read the headlines, braced for special requests, and refused them. He wore prison clothes, followed the schedule, and worked. He had been the master of his hours. Now others rang bells. The adjustment was not easy. Health problems that had been manageable outside began to show. Years earlier, he had contracted a disease that, untreated, could eat away at a mind as surely as stress eats at a stomach. Headaches, trouble concentrating, and mood swings worsened. He hid as much as he could. Inmates talk, guards talk, rumors traveled. Some said he tried to buy favors and failed, that a stash of money sewn into clothing was discovered and confiscated. Others said he accepted the rules faster than expected and kept to a routine to earn small privileges. Official records show the basics: work assignments, infractions, days without incident. He wrote to May and to his mother in simple language that focused on family and health rather than business. He asked about Sonny, who was growing up out of the spotlight, learning a quieter life than the one his father had chosen. He thanked relatives who sent kind words. He kept his feelings about the outside world to himself, understanding that every letter is read twice in places where privacy is a gift no one receives. He received a small stream of visitors when regulations allowed, never enough to make the world feel normal, always enough to remind him it still existed beyond stone. Looking back on the path to that cell, his public record is not mysterious. He made money through activities that broke the law: bootlegging liquor during Prohibition, operating gambling rooms without licenses, running brothels through intermediaries, extorting regular payments from businesses in exchange for protection, bribing officials to look away or pass along information, influencing elections with intimidation and fraud, tampering with witnesses, and directing violent responses when rivals attacked. He gave to charities and staged gifts that helped real people. He also built a machine that taught a city to expect private deals in place of public rules. The tax case did not judge all those acts. It judged the failure to pay on income the government said he earned. Yet history ties the two threads. The enterprise created the money sent him to prison. Even in Atlanta, he looked for control where he could find it. He rose early, kept his area tidy, and tried to solve the only puzzles available. Follow instructions, avoid trouble, earn small steps toward better conditions. Some days, he managed. Some days he didn't. He learned that power in that environment meant a seat saved in the mess hall, a nod from a guard, a few minutes extra in the yard. He learned to play by rules he would have mocked outside. Chicago moved on, as cities do. New politicians promised calm. Old ones counted votes using the same arithmetic as before. Prohibition still tied the city in knots. Enforcement waxed and waned, but the symbol had shifted. The man who once posed at a ballpark in a sharp suit now stood in line in denim. Reporters wrote about his prison routine with the same fascination they once applied to his nights at clubs. A legend had entered a phase where gossip gave way to schedules set by other hands. Distance gave him time to think about what started in Brooklyn and expanded in Cicero and Miami. Whether he ever admitted regret is not recorded in any definitive way. He held to the same view when asked by friendly ears. He had satisfied demand, protected workers, and shown generosity when others showed none. He left unsaid the rest: the fear, the pressure, the way ordinary shopkeepers learned to keep 2 sets of books because they knew a visit could come from men who smiled while insisting on a weekly fee. In a quieter voice, far from cameras, perhaps he balanced those scales differently. Only he knew. The transfer that would define the next chapter came after 2 years in Atlanta. Federal officials decided that a few inmates carried too much influence even when locked away. They created a new system on an island out west, where fog rolled in and ferries made isolation a daily fact. The name would become a national shorthand for unreachable. He would board a train under guard, step onto a boat, and learn what a cell felt like when even the rumor of favoritism couldn't cross the water. Before that crossing, he took stock of what remained. A family that still visited, a body that felt older than its years, and a reputation larger than any one life, built from a blend of ambition, crime, charm, and stubborn belief that he could bend any rule to his will. The trip west began before dawn with a small team of guards, a quiet platform, and a car set aside on a long train. He kept his eyes down, knowing every window could hold a reporter hunting for one more picture. After stops nobody noticed, the journey ended at a dock where the water rolled and wind cut through coats. A launch ferried a select group of federal prisoners across to an island that sat like a stone in the bay. The warden met them with the deliberate calm of a man who liked rules more than reputations. At intake, they shaved heads, issued uniforms, and assigned numbers. He became Alcatraz inmate 85. No special favors. No soft landings. The message was unmistakable. The old way of getting comfortable inside would not work here. Alcatraz ran on schedules that didn't bend. Cells shut with crisp finality. Lights timed a day better than any wristwatch. Silence during meals meant a dining hall full of clinking utensils, the scrape of chairs, and not much else. Guards enforced routines with the steadiness of men who knew they were being tested by every new arrival. He had handled ward bosses, city clerks, aldermen, and wardens before. This place ignored charm. He adapted. He rose when told, lined up when told, and worked when told. The first job kept him in the laundry among steam and soap smell, moving linens and learning that in this place even a broom had a chain of command. He looked for small footholds. Good behavior earned a seat in the prison band, a group that practiced after work and played short sets on weekends for men who needed music to feel human. He picked up a banjo and kept a steady rhythm, while horns and a drum filled the mess hall with old tunes. He even jotted sentimental verses in a spare moment, lines that sounded like letters home set to time. Those were the few minutes when the island felt less like a rock and more like a room where the world could reach in. The rest of the day belonged to bells, corridors, and rules. He tried to keep his head down, but notoriety has its own gravity. Some inmates wanted to test the man whose name filled newspapers. One day a prisoner lunged at him with a sharp tool. Staff rushed in. The situation ended as quickly as it began. He received treatment in the infirmary and returned to routine, added a new layer of caution to an already cautious life, and learned that even without a city to manage, survival demanded attention to detail. He spent a short stretch in isolation after a minor rule dispute, enough to remind him that on this island argument bought nothing but time in a cold cell. Illness that had shadowed him for years finally took center stage. Long before prison, he had contracted a disease that doctors of that era treated with crude methods. By the mid-1930s, the infection had begun to affect his nerves and mind. Headaches came and went. Concentration slipped. Moods wandered. The prison hospital tried what medicine of the day allowed, but no pill could restore the precision that had once let him keep ledgers in his head while mediating a dozen arguments at once. Guards who saw him daily noticed a slower step. Inmates who remembered his quick replies heard pauses where none used to be. Letters to May and to his mother turned simpler, full of family notes and prayers, more about meals and health than news of the outside. From his cell, he watched the country change in ways that would have rewired his business even if he had remained free. In 1933, the nation ended its grand experiment with a constitutional amendment that made liquor legal again. Beer flowed through licensed taps. Distilleries that had once operated in secret reopened under permits and inspections. The black market empire that Prohibition had created no longer had its main product. The outfit he had built needed different income streams to stay alive. Leadership on the outside, with Frank Nitti as a visible coordinator and men like Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo learning fast, pushed harder into gambling, bookmaking, labor rackets, distribution schemes that bent laws without breaking headlines, and the same old menu of payoffs that turned red tape into a ribbon to be cut. The city didn't turn clean with repeal. It shifted. He absorbed that fact from clippings and casual remarks during visits, knowing his role had shrunk to that of a spectator who once held the steering wheel. He still kept a daily shape. Morning count, a work assignment, a meal eaten without talk, a return to the cell where he read old magazines and a few books recommended by the chaplain. Music practice gave him a goal. He tried to maintain a kind of dignity that had nothing to do with fine suits. Eyes up, words measured. No theatrics. When a newspaperman's column claimed he was running rackets from the island through coded messages, prison officials laughed. Communication was censored, visits were watched, and his mind didn't have the edge for such tricks anymore. The myth of an all-powerful puppet master died in that cell block. Chicago took on a new shape without him. Politicians found fresh balances between public crusades and private deals. The police department kept splitting between those who took pride in clean work and those who held out palms in shadow. Courts still had juries that distrusted cases built on technical violations from an era many viewed as overreach. The outfit became less a street gang and more a business consortium, cautious, quieter, allergic to headlines that scared customers. That evolution had begun under him. It matured in his absence. When people later said he invented organized crime, they missed the real story. He gave it scale, swagger, and a manager's discipline. Others turned it into a low-flash corporation. On the island, holidays felt long. He thought of family dinners on Prairie Avenue, of Sundays with his mother, of Sonny's schoolwork spread on a table. He pictured cigar smoke curling in safe rooms, not cells that smelled of disinfectant. He asked visitors for simple things: news about neighbors, whether a cousin found a job, how the old block looked after a snowfall. May carried the weight of the household with quiet resolve, raised their boy away from the worst glare of the press, and coordinated lawyers who tried to soften his time or improve his care. She learned to push without raising her voice, a talent that kept the family upright when other wives cracked under strain. By 1938, doctors recorded what the prison staff had sensed. The disease had advanced enough to limit his thinking in ways that could not be reversed. He had good days and foggy ones. He could handle a conversation but lost track if it wandered. He knew faces by heart but mixed up dates and names on the page. He could still smile at a corny joke and enjoy a melody, but the man who once remembered every promise and every payoff had been replaced by someone who needed reminders. It humbled him. He wasn't known for confessions, yet he spoke more softly about his own limits than he ever had about anything. In early 1939, the Bureau shifted him off the island to a federal institution near Los Angeles to serve the separate sentence for contempt of court, the old penalty for ignoring a subpoena. Terminal Island was no picnic, yet compared to the Rock it felt less severe. Staff there understood his medical chart and kept him close to doctors. He finished the time without incident. On release that fall, he didn't head for Chicago or Miami right away. He went to Baltimore because his condition demanded modern care. One famous hospital turned him away, refusing to treat a man whose name drew crowds. Another, Union Memorial, accepted him. He entered under watch, followed orders, and stayed long enough to stabilize. Grateful for the care, he funded equipment after he left. A gesture staff remembered when the name had long stopped selling papers. He returned to the house on Palm Island with a slower gait and a face that had lost some of its old certainty. The property still looked like a small resort, with lawns that met the water and palms that waited evening breezes with a hush. He tried fishing again, sitting for long stretches watching ripples, happy for a tug whether he caught anything or not. He tended roses with a careful hand, a hobby that gave him focus without pressure. He listened to records whose choruses he could hum from memory even when verses faded. He welcomed nieces and nephews to the porch, gave them coins for candy, and forgot the count a minute later. Strangers sometimes drifted by on boats to point and stare. Police asked them to move along. Reporters tried to get close and were turned away by a polite guard at the gate. Federal agents still filed reports. They kept an eye on visitors and checked car plates. They found no meetings that looked like business. Old colleagues, when they came, kept visits short, and when they left, drove to airports rather than back rooms. The outfit had its own leadership by then, and no longer needed the blessing of a man who could not follow a morning briefing. Taxes still nipped at the estate. Lawyers negotiated payments and settled liens with the patience required to unwind old ledgers. May signed papers, balanced household accounts, and made sure staff were paid. She wrapped the house in routines that calmed a mind that had lost some of its hooks. He had built a public image with deliberate choices tipping that made headlines, charity that filled cameras, quips that charmed reporters. Now, far from the noise, he let quiet do the work. He rose late or early depending on how he felt. He ate simple meals, sometimes the same dish day after day, because familiarity made eating easier. He took short walks. He played cards at the kitchen table with family members who didn't mind letting him win. He visited a local church when energy allowed, sat in the back, and left before the crowd poured out. He rested most afternoons and was awake some nights, a pattern common to men whose minds don't let day and evening fall into neat rows. Visitors asked what he thought about repeal or about the city he once guided like a conductor on a podium. He would smile and say the same thing he had said before prison: that people wanted what they wanted, that he had given it to them, that he had helped men keep jobs when the economy failed. He did not volunteer talk about the other half of the story, the shakedowns, the payoffs, the threats, the way fear moved through a neighborhood when an envelope was late. Family accepted the script, because reminding him of the darker facts did nothing but stir confusion or anger that never found a target. The wider world entered war in the early 1940 seconds. The house kept blackout curtains like everyone else. The radio brought news from far away. He listened, nodded, and sometimes asked if a name mentioned was someone they knew. The family said no, and changed the station to a ball game or a band show. He still loved melodies. He could still whistle a chorus a beat ahead of the trumpet. Chicago kept moving. Politicians rose and fell. The outfit navigated wartime shortages and post-war boom, anchored by men whose names were not yet famous. Courts kept trying extortion and conspiracy cases. Juries kept balancing evidence against rumor. Journalism turned him into shorthand, even when he lived quietly by the water. A bad block in any city could be tagged with his name, even if decades separated the trouble from his time. That's what happens when a man becomes symbol as much as person. Through those years, his crimes stayed written in court transcripts, police files, and the memories of those who paid his collectors or hid behind counters when rival crews drove by. Bootlegging had been the foundation. Illegal gambling supplied steady cash when repeal took away beer profits. Houses of vice paid a share. Business owners paid for insurance that reduced the chances of smashed windows or missing deliveries. Elections bore the weight of watchers who favored one ticket. Officials received illegal payments to soften enforcement or pass warnings. Witnesses felt pressure to forget. When violence erupted, it did so as part of a system designed to protect income. The tax counts that ended his freedom represented the government's angle. If you earned money that way, you owed a share. That was the point that stuck in court. Even in retreat, he preserved pockets of dignity. He said hello to neighbors without pretense. He treated gardeners and drivers with respect, a habit carried from earlier years when loyalty meant survival. He took pleasure in weather reports and a good sandwich, in a perfectly folded handkerchief, in a tie knotted by muscle memory even when he had nowhere to go. He had lost the city. He had not lost his manners. Doctors visited to check his pulse and to chart a slow slide they could not stop. They recommended rest and routine. May kept a notebook with medications and appointment times. She turned away the curious, welcomed the kind, and reminded friends that gossip had no place in a home that survived on calm. When reporters pressed for quotes, she said he was resting. That was true on most days, and enough on the others. From the island where he wore a number to the porch where he watched clouds drift over still water, the arc of those years had a clear shape. A man who built a machine on broken laws learned what it meant to live under rules that wouldn't bend. A manager who turned chaos into schedules felt his own mind slip out of its once perfect order. A public figure who exploited publicity as a tool stepped back into private life and found that life tolerable only in small rooms with family nearby. He had been a master of momentum. Now he studied the quiet and let minutes pass without trying to buy them. Winter sunlight in Florida fell across the lawn like a soft blanket. He walked slow, one hand grazing the tops of hedges trimmed by a gardener who understood quiet. Days took on a pattern that barely felt like time. A late breakfast, a few pages of the paper, an hour with a fishing rod balanced on his knee, a nap, music on a small radio, family voices in the next room. Boats idled past the seawall as if sightseeing along a museum exhibit. The man on the porch was that famous name, but neighbors saw mostly a husband and a father who waved, smiled, and went back to a chair with a cushion worn in the same place. Physicians visited often. Charts showed what everyone close had already sensed. The illness first caught in younger years had advanced in ways medicine then could only slow, not reverse. Some mornings he was alert, ready with a quip, eager to show guests a rosebud that opened overnight. Other mornings he drifted, lost a name he had said for decades, stared at a doorway as if answers might pass through it. In 1946, a team of doctors examined him over days and reached a blunt conclusion for court and family. His mind no longer moved with the precision it once had. Reports used language that tried to be clinical and landed like a thud at the kitchen table. May listened, thanked the specialists, and kept the house steady, because steadiness was what he needed most. Visitors came in measured trickles. Old allies stopped by with careful words, never long enough to spark gossip. Relatives brought cakes or fruit, and left with envelopes of grocery money they didn't request but accepted with thanks. Sonny, now a young man, spoke quietly, leaned close when his father missed a phrase, steered talk toward family news, and learned to hold conversations that didn't require sharp recollection. He had lived with ear trouble since childhood, and grew into a man who preferred low profiles and clear, honest routines. He would eventually take a new last name to move through the world without strangers pausing at every introduction. The estate itself had a rhythm. Staff opened shutters at dawn and shut them when the sky went pink. A housekeeper polished frames with photographs from every decade. The Brooklyn boy in a cap, the newly married couple, the proud father holding a swaddled infant, the smiling man in a suit near a ballpark, the inmate in a plain shirt with a guarded expression, the Florida resident in a linen jacket beside a hibiscus with brilliant petals. On a side table lay clippings kept more out of habit than pride, articles that praised charity, editorials that condemned his empire, curious profiles that tried to reconcile both. Even far from Chicago, a connection to the city remained. Agents still filed periodic notes about the household, out of duty as much as suspicion. Reports mentioned lawn tasks, strolls, naps, simple dinners, nothing that hinted at secret command. Lawyers visited to discuss old tax obligations, property liens, and paperwork tied to earlier years. Those discussions were dull by design. Everything flashy had been stripped away by courts and time. The outfit on the lakefront ran under new leaders who kept public drama to a minimum, preferring reliable income from gambling and rackets woven into business life. They did not require advice from a man who now measured days in cups of coffee and hands of cards. News from Chicago and beyond filtered in. A radio voice announced repeal long ago. By now, listeners tuned to ball games, band concerts, and early wartime bulletins. Chicago learned the names of fresh officials and fresh scandals. The outfit found a different posture after Frank Nitty's fall in 1943, with Rica and Accardo maintaining calm while avoiding the spotlight. To the degree anyone asked what the former boss thought about these shifts, the answer was always the same. Family claimed his attention, health set the limits, and the era defined by his decisions had closed. He did not stop giving. The hospital in Baltimore that cared for him when another declined received a gift for equipment. A thank you that stayed quiet until staff told the story years later. Local churches benefited from envelopes pressed into palms after Mass. If a gardener mentioned a niece who needed tuition, a solution appeared. Those gestures did not erase his record. They matched what he had done in earlier decades, support for select causes, and sat alongside the same ledger that had once recorded illegal income from bootlegging, gambling rooms without licenses, brothels that paid a cut, protection fees extracted from shopkeepers, bribes to public officials, manipulation of elections, threats against witnesses, and directions to retaliate when rivals attacked. Both sides had always existed at once. The last winter came quickly. In January 1947, he suffered a stroke. Doctors rushed in. The house shifted into a clinical quiet made of hushed steps, cool cloths, and family hands held for reassurance. A brief rally raised hopes, then pneumonia set in, and days later a heart stopped after years that had compressed into seasons. He died at 48. Younger than the image of a legend would make you think. The porch chair sat empty. The fishing rod leaned against a wall as if waiting for one more afternoon, and voices drifted in from the kitchen with that blend of grief and duty that fills a home after loss. Calls to relatives, arrangements with clergy, A pot of coffee poured again and again. The funeral was simple compared with the spectacle some expected. Reporters noted the procession. Police kept order. Old associates sent flowers. Spats and power plays paused for a day out of respect or theater. Take your pick. He was buried in Chicago, and later reinterred at a cemetery where family already lay, a closing of a circle that started in a tenement and wound through saloons, courts, prison yards, and a quiet island street. His mother, who had watched children grow into adults with all the joy and worry that task brings, outlived him and visited the grave with the same faith that had anchored her from the beginning. May settled the estate with patience. Papers were signed, taxes paid, staff thanked, and loose threads tied in a file cabinet rather than with headlines. She protected her son's privacy and declined interviews designed to squeeze old drama into new cycles. She kept a few routines exactly as before. Fresh flowers in the dining room on Sundays, a certain dessert on holidays, a photograph on the mantel dusted by hand. Time took the sting from some memories and sharpened others. Sonny built an ordinary life as best he could. Work, a marriage, children, bills, doctor's visits. He chose the path of a citizen who wanted to be known for his own decisions, not for a surname that could bend a room. His hearing trouble demanded concentration. He compensated with eye contact and patience that made conversations richer. Now and then, someone recognized him despite the name change and asked questions he had learned to deflect without anger. He shared a few stories with family when it fit. Most days he let history stay on the shelf. Chicago, freed from the national appetite for stories about one name, kept evolving. The outfit remained, less loud and more complex, operating casinos far from the old brewery maps, shaping union contracts, playing in markets where numbers could be tilted without gunfire. Law enforcement changed too. The strategy that helped bring down the Prohibition empire, follow the money, document spending, build cases through ledgers and witnesses who handled cash, became a template used over and over. Later laws gave prosecutors tools to treat criminal businesses as businesses, not just as clusters of hotheads. That shift traced a line back to a courtroom where a judge told a defendant that no private deal could bind a court. How to hold all of this at once, the generosity and the shakedowns, the soup kitchen and the ballot box intimidation, the banjo in a prison band and the bookkeeping that dodged taxes, remains the trick for anyone trying to see the whole. The story's real engine is Prohibition. A national law created a black market vast enough to make a city's underworld look like an industry. He didn't invent vice, he industrialized it, turning scattered rackets into a lattice that moved liquor by the truckload, standardized payoffs, and treated violence as a controlled cost rather than a daily advertisement. He argued that he met demand. The law said demand was not the point, conduct was. The law won when it found the right lever. He could be charming, even kind, to children and waiters and his mother. He could be ruthless toward rivals and unyielding with shopkeepers who hesitated to pay for protection. He liked baseball, good food, and tidy shoes. He cultivated reporters one day and cursed headlines the next. He took pride in running a smooth operation and bristled when amateurs caused messy scenes. He believed he could bend any room to his will. Then he met rooms with bars and schedules that didn't care about will. If you gather the facts without stage lighting, what remains is both simple and complicated. Simple. A man broke laws for profit, corrupted public offices, and maintained power with intimidation and targeted violence. Complicated. He also used charisma and cash to turn parts of a city into a network that paid wages and rent when the economy failed, which made neighbors defend him even as others suffered under his system's weight. He was a symptom of a policy choice, as much as a cause of misery and fear. When that policy ended, his empire needed reinvention, and found it without him. The myth took on its own life as soon as the first flashbulb popped. Books, radio plays, films, and later television turned his name into a shortcut for an era. Some versions lean into suits and cigars, others into cold hallways and whispered commands. Real life looked like paperwork and planning punctuated by sudden crises. The house style he codified: pay for silence, spread risk, put relatives and lifelong friends in key roles, rotate routes, never repeat a pattern, smile in public, avoid chaos that scares civilians flowed into the post-war outfit and into other cities' underworlds. The last years, those quiet Florida afternoons, added a final layer rarely captured in glossy depictions. A disease that wasn't treated well in its early stage dimmed a clever mind, rewired moods, and left him reliant on family. That is also part of the record, a reminder that even large reputations are attached to bodies that wear out and to households that keep going with grocery lists and medicine schedules. When he died, the neighbors saw a funeral. Chicago saw a chapter close. Lawyers saw files to be archived. The outfit saw a transition already complete. For the people who lived under his rise, certain memories never faded. A tailor who paid weekly insurance remembered the relief when the envelope was accepted and the dread when it wasn't. A bartender who watched a backroom door felt a city's pulse speed up when patrolmen arrived, then slow again after a call from a friend in the precinct. A widow who collected a check after a raid put food on the table and chose not to ask where the money came from. An alderman balanced requests from precinct captains against visits from men who spoke softly about consequences. Teachers noticed that some kids wore new coats bought with cash that had no clean trail. The story lives in those small, real pieces as much as it lives in headlines. By the time the house on Palm Island settled into a new routine without him, the era that built his power had become history class material. Scholars tabulated arrests and indictments, described networks using charts and arrows, debated which assassination plotted by which side tipped this rivalry or that election. Ordinary citizens remembered the fear of a knock on the door and the thrill of a hidden club, then measured both against the stability that came after the experiment with a dry country ended. The lessons took root in law textbooks, in city halls where reformers tried again, and in precinct rooms where officers rejected envelopes that older colleagues once accepted. All the way back at the beginning, a boy in Brooklyn left school after a fight and found teachers on street corners who paid in coin and risk. Those lessons, loyalty, timing, the use of fear, the value of a calm tone carried him to a national stage and then into cells and hospital rooms where none of that mattered. The record he left is not clean and not entirely dark. It is, like most lives writ large, a mix of calculation, appetite, affection, denial, and an unshakable belief that personal order can replace public rules. For a while, in one city during one law that magnified opportunity, he made that belief real. Then the law changed, courts adjusted, and time did what time does, closing the book, even as new chapters in other hands kept being written. After the burial, two versions of him traveled side by side. One lived in photographs and headlines, the compact man in a sharp suit who smiled as if every room was his. The other lived in files, a paper trail of ledgers, affidavits, and court orders that showed how power had been built. In living rooms, people argued about which was more real. In offices where cases were taught to new investigators, the answer was simple: follow the paper. Chicago adjusted to life without his voice. The outfit settled under leaders who valued steady income over fame. Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo shaped a quiet empire that kept the lights low and the profits regular, a style very different from the earlier era of parade cameras and balcony quotes. Frank Nitti, who had taken on a larger role during the prison years, had already fallen, leaving the message that flamboyance carried a cost. Gambling in back rooms linked to hotels and clubs became the main engine. Union influence turned into contracts that could be steered. Loans with harsh terms kept businesses in line. Las Vegas, once a dusty stop, grew into a new frontier where outfit money, often hidden behind fronts, helped build casino floors that looked nothing like the beer flats of the 1,920 The shape of the machine changed. The core idea remained. Control markets that crave excitement, keep officials friendly, and avoid fights that draw too much heat. Television arrived and carried a fresh flood of stories. In the early 1950 Senate hearings chaired by Estes K. Fauver put organized crime on the nation's front step. Viewers watched men who would never have sat in the same room answer questions under oath. Chicago's network appeared in charts and testimony. The hearings did not resurrect the old boss. They placed him in a lineage. He was not the start of it. He had been the clearest face of a phase when an unusual law made opportunities bloom. Later documentaries and dramas circled back to him because a name that once filled front pages makes a tidy hook. But the more the story was retold, the easier it became to mistake showmanship for structure. That structure, built in his time, had been simple to describe and hard to fight. Illegal alcohol brought in steady money during Prohibition. Gambling houses and backroom card clubs added a dependable stream. Brothels run by intermediaries paid a share. Storefronts and factories handed over weekly payments, labeled as protection against trouble. Ward offices learned to expect cash during campaigns. Inspectors and officers received envelopes to turn a raid into a brief delay or a call before a door swung open. Witnesses who chose to speak sometimes changed their minds after nighttime visits. Rivals who attacked could expect a response, quick and targeted, intended to protect routes and income. That list, pieced together from indictments, police records, and sworn statements, formed the record. When the trial finally came, the lever used by the government was the tax code, not a single shootout or one dramatic raid. That is the lesson that stuck. Numbers can do what bullets cannot. Hollywood made its own version. A 1932 film took his rise and gave it a title that echoed a nickname he disliked, presenting a brash figure who clawed upward until the machine swallowed him. Later decades gave the Untouchables their turn in the spotlight, first on television, then in a movie that turned investigations into set pieces. Those tales captured truths about public defiance and the value of clean agents, even as historians pointed out that the quiet grind of Treasury accountants did more to close the case than any axe swung at a vat. He would have understood how myths take root. He had fed myths when it suited him. Stories attached themselves to objects. A bullet-resistant Cadillac seized by the government turned into the subject of anecdotes about a president borrowing it on a tense day. A hotel suite he once used became a stage for a made-for-television special, built around sealed rooms and rumors of hidden caches. Cameras went live. Walls came down. Dust filled the air. The vault turned out to be empty. That spectacle said as much about the public appetite for legend as it did about the man himself. The truth was always less theatrical. Money washed through banks under relatives' names into bonds and properties that lawyers later haggled over. Whatever secret hoard people imagined was more likely a set of deposits, receipts, and payments scattered across time, not a treasure chest bricked behind a wall. Family life moved on with care. May kept her promise to protect privacy. She answered letters from people who wanted interviews with polite refusals. She paid remaining tax bills, settled suits, and kept photographs grouped by decade rather than by drama. Sonny took the quieter path he had already chosen, living under a different last name, working ordinary jobs, and making a household that could sit at a restaurant without turning heads. Hearing trouble pressed him to listen closely and speak carefully, gifts in their own way. When he died in 2004, obituaries mentioned both the link to his father and the care he took to make his own life small and decent. The city changed its tools. Lessons taken from the tax case and the years that followed hardened into doctrine. Build cases with receipts, not rumors. Look for spending that cannot be explained by declared income. Track cashier's checks to the person who brought the cash to the counter. Flip the bookkeeper rather than chase the boss around town. Later laws gave prosecutors even stronger levers, treating organizations as entities rather than bundles of individuals, allowing leaders to be held to account for crimes they ordered or profited from. Those ideas were not born in a single courtroom, but the 1931 conviction turned them into a model everyone understood. Historians went back to the start and found a boy in overcrowded Brooklyn rooms, students jostling for a seat, a teenager who left school after a confrontation. They found a job at a Coney Island tavern, a scar that followed him into adulthood, a marriage to a young woman from an Irish family, a son born early, and a move to a city where ambition and opportunity met an unusual law. They found Frankie Yale's world in New York, Johnny Torrio's calm in Chicago, and a shift from one type of vice to another when Prohibition rewired the market. They followed the trail through Cicero's town hall, election day tensions, Frank Capone's fatal encounter with police, and the way that loss hardened the younger brother who remained. They tracked the feud with the North Side, the ambushes, the retaliations, the attempts at truces, the way rules developed to keep civilians out of harm's way when possible because harm brought heat that cost money. They traced payments to officials across departments and years. They placed him at ball games and prize fights, arms draped across shoulders in photos that humanized a man the state defined by charges. They noted every charge that stuck and every rumor that never landed in a verdict. Income tax evasion, proven in court with documents and testimony. Contempt of court, conceded when he refused a subpoena. Prohibition violations, charged and dropped or rolled into other cases as strategy shifted. Many acts that people associate with his name: arranging an ambush, planning a killing, issuing the final word on arrival, never resulted in convictions against him personally. Yet the system he ran carried out those acts. People paid for routes. People died in targeted attacks that cleared obstacles. The distinction between the hand on the trigger and the hand on the payroll matters in court. It matters less to the families who watched a chair remain empty at dinner. Reformers look back and argued that policy opened the door more than any one man did. Prohibition turned ordinary appetites into crimes overnight, handing entrepreneurs a product with a huge market and no legal supplier. The result was predictable. Profits big enough to buy influence, police morale tested by envelopes that solved immediate problems, and a population that learned to live with a double life: public law and private practice. When repeal came, the outline of the black market didn't disappear. It shifted into gambling and other rackets that did not depend on a constitutional anomaly. Cities that hoped crime would vanish learned instead that once an organization exists, it adapts. He was not a philosopher, but he had a line he used whenever anyone stuck a microphone near his grin. He was a businessman meeting demand. That line resonated in hard times when jobs vanished and his trucks still ran. It looked thinner when seen next to the practices that kept the wheels spinning. Forced payments from shopkeepers who risked harassment if they refused. Slates he favored pushed at polling places by watchers whose faces meant trouble. Envelopes passed to officers and clerks who understood what was expected. Witnesses reminded that their families lived on certain streets. A soup kitchen does not cancel out the ledger behind it. It coexists with it. Part of his pull came from that uneasy coexistence. People prefer simple stories. He offered a complicated one and wrapped it in style. After his death, his Florida house changed hands. Decades later, it drew headlines again when new owners planned to knock it down. Then local voices argued it had historic weight, even if its past was messy. Artifacts from his life, monogrammed items, photographs, a few personal objects went to auction and stirred the same debate that has always surrounded his name. Are such items history to be preserved or souvenirs to be sold? You could ask the same question about the hotel, where reporters once waited in a lobby for a quote. Buildings carry the marks of their time. So do objects that sit behind glass in a museum case. Myths accreted around details until they looked like facts. Some said he personally ordered every ambush. Others said he always kept a flower in his lapel. People told stories about secret tunnels under hotels or about trucks full of cash hidden in farmland. A few may hold a sliver of truth. Most are products of a city's love for tales that make a night at a bar livelier. The record, when weighed carefully, is already full enough. He rose because he learned organization and influence. He lasted as long as he did because he bought time with charm, money, and discipline. He fell because a patient team showed that spending without declared income leaves a trail even the boldest figure cannot explain. You can't talk about his life without talking about the police and courts of the time. There were officers who refused money and made raids that cost his operations dearly. There were officers who accepted envelopes and sent warnings before warrants arrived. There were judges who insisted that courthouses were not for bargains. There were judges who treated certain defendants with unusual courtesy. Juries carried their own mix of feelings: dislike for prohibition itself, sympathy for business owners who faced extortion, distrust of witnesses who once took pay from the very people they were now testifying against. In that fog, his public personality often outshone his private conduct. He knew how to fill the space with stories people told each other at dinner. The wider country changed too. National gun laws tightened during the 1930 seconds, part of a response to highly publicized violence by gangsters of several cities. The federal agency that would later be known as the FBI expanded its mission and public image. Tax enforcement gained a certain glamour in the eyes of young lawyers who saw in those cases a way to make a mark without chasing cars. Media grew more sophisticated, more able to create a national figure out of a local tale. By the time his name had passed from fresh news to curriculum, his life had become a quick way to introduce the entire Prohibition era. Bad law, black market, corruptible institutions, heady profits, focused enforcement, a fall determined by numbers rather than bullets. Family memories are smaller and less dramatic. Relatives spoke about a man who doted on his mother, who stood for photographs with nieces and nephews, who remembered birthdays and sent flowers to a funeral, even when he barely knew the deceased. They also spoke about the weight he carried into the house when a week had been hot, about the way guards by the door became part of a household, about reporters who camped on a sidewalk and yelled questions that no one answered. In those rooms, crime was not a story. It was a job you never fully left at the office. The soundtrack was silverware clinking, a radio in the corner, and the low hum of a city's attention pressing through windows. He never wrote a confession, never set down in his own words what he thought of it all. Interviews during his prime showed a man who believed he was unfairly singled out, that he kept peace in neighborhoods his critics didn't understand, that he treated rivals as businessmen until they forced his hand. Records kept by others tell a larger truth. His work was against the law. It depended on coercion, on payments that bent public institutions, on violence that was targeted but real. The fame came from that tension. He was both a neighbor who signed a check for a school and a figure whose organization demanded money from a baker down the block. People still argue over which mattered more. The answer is that both did. That is why the story endures. Legends rarely end. They soften until they feel like weather that drifts in and out of a city's day. His name settled into that kind of air. Teachers used it when explaining why bold laws create unexpected markets. Guides on Chicago buses pointed at corners where deals once happened. Writers traced lines on maps to show how a teenager from Brooklyn stepped through saloon doors and, in time, rewired an entire scene. Police academies replayed the case as a lesson in building files, not just making arrests. In quiet archives, clerks boxed ledgers seized in raids long ago. Each page a faint echo of nights when trucks pulled away from warehouses and a dispatcher kept his pencil moving to stay ahead of a clock. You can return to the first causes and watch the setup unfold. Immigrant households crowded into tenements with thin walls and heavy dreams. School felt cramped for kids who needed more than chalk and rules. Neighborhood crews offered cash, belonging, and a fast track to respect. New York taught him how to carry himself, how to learn a room before he spoke, how to mix patience with nerve. Chicago taught him scale. Torrio handed him a blueprint for profit under a ban that turned liquor from a tavern staple into a contraband industry. The city's political machine, already expert at counting votes, learned to count envelopes that arrived on time. Those factors sat waiting. He supplied organization and a face the public couldn't ignore. He learned early that a smile can lower guards, and that cash on the table beats speeches. He put relatives and friends in jobs that mattered, trusting loyalty over resumes. Breweries hid behind blank walls. Trucks ran late to avoid patrols. Insurance collectors moved block by block, selling safety in neighborhoods where safety had been put up for sale. Gambling dens took bets and funneled a portion upstairs. Brothels operated under managers who pushed their problems up the chain only when needed. Election days became operations. Friendly names were pushed. Unfriendly ones met pressure varying from chatter at corners to watchers who stood close at a polling place. City workers who cooperated found extra pay that arrived in envelopes without return addresses. Those who resisted sometimes found a surprise visit from men who preferred warnings to arguments in front of witnesses. At the same time, he kept a kind of neighborliness that confused critics and delighted a slice of the public. He tipped waiters, covered funeral costs for families in shock, sent boxes of food to households that needed a break. He funded beds at hospitals and uniforms for boys who wanted to play ball. He did it because he liked the feeling and because he understood what it bought. Goodwill that could blur a hard truth. Many people remember the soup line he paid for during a winter when jobs vanished and coal stoves ran low. The photographs from that doorway held a power no editorial could match. They lived beside other facts, not on top of them. Rivalries defined stretches of his climb. O'Banion's florist shop, Torrio's near miss, Jaime Weiss's fury, Moran's defiance, the garage on Clark Street that still draws attention every February. Even though the building is gone, all those entries sit in any careful timeline. Police never proved he ordered each strike. Chicago lived with the results anyway. A series of targeted attacks that kept routes clear and reputations intact. He preferred order because order made money. When talks failed, he allowed for a kind of violence meant to be quick and contained. It didn't always stay that way. Every headline put new pressure on City Hall and on Washington. The wise move after each explosion was the same. Lower the volume, keep schedules, pay who needed payment, bring lawyers into the plan. The fall came from paper, not from a final duel. Investigators followed spending that far outpaced declared income. Bank clerks pointed to cashiers' checks bought with bundles of cash. Bookkeepers walked agents through coded entries that described real flows of money. A letter intended as an opening offer on a tax bill became a key exhibit. In court, a judge switched a jury panel to undercut tampering and told both sides that private deals held no force inside his room. The verdict turned a national figure into federal property. 11 years announced themselves with the clank of a gate. The fine and the unpaid balance on taxes made the point that a government can punish without catching a man with a crate in his hand. Prison life showed a different version of him. He followed rules, did laundry work, kept rhythm in a band, wrote soft verses, and declined to test a system built to resist charm. A knife-like tool flashed once in a corridor. Guards handled it. The lesson stuck. Illness that started long before took hold. Doctors recorded a slide they could slow with rest but not fix. On the island in the bay, a number replaced his old titles. Later, in Baltimore, doctors who agreed to treat him did so without asking for headlines. He thanked them the way he knew, with a gift that bought equipment their patients needed. Palm Island became a retreat shaped by family, routine, and a new kind of dignity that had nothing to do with crowds. What he built did not vanish when he went in. The outfit learned to avoid the front page while keeping registers ringing. New leaders emphasized quiet profits. Repeal erased bootlegging but left the network mostly intact. It diverted energy into gambling, influence over unions and trucking, loan schemes with heavy terms, and indirect slices of new projects in a city always under construction. Later decades moved action west to casinos in the desert and east to places where numbers games lived behind barbershops. He had taught structure. Successors used it in markets less likely to draw federal agents with axes and photographers in tow. Public memory flipped between romance and reprimand. Radio shows and films painted him as an anti-hero or a cautionary tale, depending on the mood. Essayists talked about corruption as an inevitability in cities that grow faster than their rules. Lawyers lectured on the power of tax law when glamorous cases stall. Tour guides polished stories for visitors who wanted a shiver without a lecture. Historians kept adding details that complicate easy views. A wedding license signed at 18, a telegram to a grieving family, a list of payoffs that crossed departments, a meeting in a hotel suite where a map of the Midwest spread across a table showed delivery routes arranged to avoid drama. Real life looks like that, mostly work, with occasional jolts that rearrange plans. His effect on culture goes beyond plots and costumes. He left behind a template for how media can inflate a figure until it obscures the system around him. He understood that better than most. He courted reporters, permitted staged photos, told quips that would print cleanly, and then complained when the coverage turned punitive. That cycle turned him into the name regular people knew when they didn't know all the others doing similar work more quietly. The twist is that this attention helped drive the case that finally stuck. Fame wrote addresses for agents who needed to know where to look. It also inspired reforms that outlived him. Better coordination between local and federal offices, training that emphasized financial investigations, and a recognition that you can't fight a business-like enterprise with only street tactics. There is a human core that survives all the analysis. A son who sent his mother roses, a husband who relied on his wife to steady the home when he could not, a father who tried to shield his boy from a trade that paid well and cost more. There is also the shopkeeper who faced an impossible monthly choice, that pay a fee he could not afford, or risk smashed windows and missing shipments he could afford even less. Both scenes belong in the same story. One doesn't cancel the other. That tension explains why people still argue about him at kitchen tables and on front stoops. He is a mirror that shows one city's contradictions: hustle and kindness, cruelty and order, community pride and civic rot. If you draw up the ledger of his conduct, the entries are plain. Illegal production and sale of alcohol during a national ban, operation of gambling rooms outside the law, control of brothels through intermediaries, extortion of regular payments from businesses in exchange for protection, bribery of officials to slow or redirect enforcement, manipulation of elections through intimidation and fraud, tampering with witnesses to blunt prosecutions, direction of retaliations when rivals struck, evasion of income tax on profits from those activities, refusal to answer a federal subpoena which brought a contempt sentence. Everything else is color. That list is the record, compiled from sworn testimony, court rulings, police files, and the memories of those who worked for or against him. What remains after all that arithmetic is a lesson about policy. Make a popular product illegal, and you create a black market with margins big enough to warp institutions. Let city machines run without oversight, and they will trade order for envelopes. Assume a legend must fall to a dramatic ambush, and you miss the quiet strength of a well-built case made by people who prefer calculators to cameras. These ideas were not new when he lived, yet his rise and fall made them visible to millions in a way textbooks could not. He did not get the ending films would give him. No final speech on a balcony, no last duel in an alley, no secret tunnel carrying him away to a private dock. A stroke, a bout of pneumonia, a grave in the city where most of the story happened. It is smaller than the myth and truer too. Most lives close that way, with family near and ordinary items in the room. A glass of water, a folded sweater, a radio playing a tune from years earlier. The size of a reputation doesn't change how bodies tire. Walk through Chicago today, and you can still trace him if you know where to look. A former hotel renamed, and then demolished after a long stretch of neglect. A Prairie Avenue house that once held Sunday dinners, and currently sits on a block that carries very different worries. A suburb that was a headquarters during a crackdown, now absorbed into the larger sprawl of a metropolis rebuilt several times since. A church across from a corner where a famous attack caught daylight as if to prove no place is sacred when money and rage collide. The sites do not hold magic. They hold stories told to anyone who will listen long enough to set aside the easy version. The quiet of his last home offered its own kind of answer. He liked to sit by the water and watch light fade. He liked simple food and a deck of cards. He liked company that didn't ask questions he could not answer. He had been the center of a city's noise. He ended as a man who needed rest. If there is a moral worth taking to bed, it might be this. Order built on private deals looks stable until the day it stops, and then it leaves everyone scrambling: the boss who thought charm could bend any rule, the clerk who took envelopes to pay rent, the shopkeeper who kept 2 sets of books, the officer who accepted 1 favor too many. Public rules are clumsy, slow, often disappointing. They are also the only way to keep a city from becoming a negotiation conducted in whispers. His name will keep appearing in new formats, podcasts, streaming series, school projects, because it solves a storyteller's problem. It gives a face to an era that might otherwise feel like a list of dates. The patience required to see the full picture makes a different demand. It asks us to see the boy who left school, the husband who tried to please his wife, the neighbor who gave a tip big enough to buy groceries, the executive who treated bribes like a line item, the boss who carried responsibility for harm done by men on his payroll, the prisoner who kept time with a band, the patient whose illness outpaced medicine, the retiree who waved to passing boats. All of it happened. All of it belongs. When you close your eyes on this story, the city dims. Streetlights flicker on. A train rolls past the river. Somewhere, a backroom door closes with a soft click. The ledger's last line has already been written. What endures is the caution that numbers can capture, a rise no boasts can explain, that a smile can hide a bill arriving later, that public trust once sold takes a long time to buy back. He believed in personal order. The city taught him, and everyone else, that shared rules, imperfect as they are the only reliable piece. That, more than any nickname or photograph, is the piece of his story worth carrying into tomorrow. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Al Capone here, thanking you for joining me on a journey through the golden age of power, loyalty, and ambition. If this story kept you company tonight, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire guide your rest, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.